Please welcome to the stage the Executive Director of Giffords, Peter Ambler.
How about the Attorney General of Minnesota, Keith Ellison? All right. Well, you know what they say, those who cannot do, moderate. So here I am. But nonetheless, I am just really honored to be joined by this powerhouse panel. I'm going to do some quick introductions, and then we're going to just dig right into this topic. First, on my right, I've got Ruth Glenn, a friend to many in this room, a survivor of domestic violence herself, and the public affairs president of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Give it up for Ruth. Also distinctly honored to be joined by the mayor of Kansas City, the co-chair of the Mayors Against Illegal Guns, a national leader on any number of issues, Mayor Quinton Lucas. To his right, we have an individual who has led, I think it is literally indescribable how much work he is responsible for in the state of New Jersey, first as chief counsel, now as the state's attorney general, Matt Platkin. And another powerful leader and friend of the movement, the senior director of federal government affairs at Everytown for Gun Safety, a survivor himself, Rob Wilcox. And I think as many of you know, Rob recently had a star turn answering some pretty tough questions from some Republican congressmen in the House Judiciary Committee. So I think maybe the four of us could just gang up on you and you could relive that experience.
I mean, only in my nightmares.
Okay. Well, you did phenomenal work and really represented all of us, so thank you. Mayor Lucas, let's start with you. You're on the front lines as a mayor in Kansas City, and now you have the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act in your pocket in your everyday fight against shootings and gun violence. Let's drill down specifically on two core provisions: the brand new trafficking law, something that's not talked a lot about, but as part of this bill, we passed for the first time in this country a strong federal statute against gun trafficking and addressed straw purchasing in a new way. So how are you working with federal and state authorities to use that law to protect people in your city?
So first of all, thank you all so much for being here. I come in peace from a red state. And I know some of y'all there too. And so we need this support, this energy, this activity, because it helps make a difference in the Kansas Cities, St. Louis, Memphis, so many places where we deal with this issue each and every day. I think about this question with a conversation I recently had. I had a meeting with a group of 14 and 15-year-olds, some of whom are justice involved, and I'm a bit naive. I asked, where do you get your gun at 13 or 14 that you're carrying around regularly? And this kid looked at me almost kind of nonchalantly and said, I can get it on the street corner. I can get it anywhere. We have a substantial trafficking problem. And what we were seeing before the passage of the act was that our state prosecutors didn't fully have the tools to address it. There are a lot of reasons for that, including one of the dumbest laws in the history of time, the Second Amendment Preservation Act, where Missouri said that the Second Amendment laws, in essence, gun laws, don't apply to them. It's bizarre, and it was wrong. So we needed to have an opportunity for federal prosecutors and federal agencies to be able to actually get traffickers, to make sure that they were able to do investigations and align with our police officers in connection with it. Another area that we're seeing a lot of this work in is in straw purchasers. So as you all probably know, there aren't that many guns that are produced in America's major cities, right? Kansas City doesn't have a big gun plant, but we have a lot of guns. And so we recognize that they were coming from somewhere. I'll give one example. There was a Nevada manufacturer who was selling directly to pawn shops and others in Kansas City, and those guns were ending up on homicide scenes, on shooting scenes repeatedly. What we did before was filed civil actions to try to address it. But now, with the passage of the act, we have the opportunity to have real intervention and support from ATF and other federal agencies. This is getting guns off the streets. It's getting guns out of the hands of 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, and those older. And frankly, long-term, it is allowing us to have tools at a time when particularly red states are fighting against every bit of responsible, not just gun legislation, but responsible common sense intervention that makes our community safer.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your leadership. Ruth, we're going to turn to you next. We've talked a lot already today about the power of this movement. 550 pieces of legislation in 49 different states over the past decade, and of course, the passage of the bipartisan Safer Communities Act. But with those political successes come the vital need to focus on implementation. Implementation is always difficult when it comes to the nexus between firearms and domestic violence.
Yes.
And that's going to be very, very true when it comes to one of the most important provisions of the Safer Communities Act, which is the provision that narrows the boyfriend loophole and works to get guns out of the hands of violent dating partners. So if you could just sort of talk a little bit about that provision, and then most importantly, talk about the work that has been done and needs to be done to ensure that it's having its maximum effect.
Absolutely. I too thank everyone for being here, and certainly Senator Murphy pulling this together. And this is really important. And someone said, we have to celebrate our successes, but we also can't stop. And particularly when it comes to firearms and domestic violence. As a survivor myself, this work is very, very important to me because I know the real life impact of what happens when there's a firearm involved in an incident of domestic violence where somebody is trying to hurt someone else in a close relationship. One of the things that happened is it did narrow the loophole, which we were really grateful for, which allowed, more access to perpetrators having firearms when there's domestic violence present. So we're very excited about that. We had many a conversation about that. I also testified, and everything we could to make it even more narrow. In other words, making sure that it's not just encompassed in the intimate familial type relationship, but that it also includes dating partners. There's 1,000% chance that if you're in a relationship in which someone is trying to hurt you, 1,000% chance that if they have a weapon, it's going to be harmful. One of the other things that we talk a lot about, in particular in the dating loophole, is that we have to continue to narrow that because it's not just about the lethality of having a firearm in that situation. And we know that increasingly dating partners are using firearms to keep control. So it's really, really important that we look at the bigger picture as we move forward and really work to implement an even tighter control, and I hate to use that word, but tighter accountability. Let's call it accountability of those who are possessing firearms and using those not just to kill, but to intimidate, harass, threaten. So we're going to continue to work on that, but we certainly did take a moment to celebrate what has happened.
All right, thank you so much,
Yes,
Ruth,
thank you.
for your work and for that response. Attorney General Placken, I referenced some of your achievements. You've addressed ghost guns. You've instituted an innovative civil litigation program, taking on the gun industry, so much more. But until recently, you haven't had a lot of help from Congress. We've talked a lot about over the years this iron pipeline, right, where states that have weaker gun laws funnel firearms into states like New Jersey that have stronger gun laws. So with this new trafficking law and other elements of the bill, how are you going to use that, working with federal partners and others to directly attack this iron pipeline?
Yeah, well, thank you, Peter. And first of all, let me just say thank you so much to Senator Murphy for pulling this together. It is extraordinary to see all of you here. I think back to how I first got engaged in this movement. I grew up in the Columbine generation, and I first started advocating when I was in high school for a renewal of the assault weapons ban. I had friends going off to war, and I didn't understand then, frankly don't understand now, why the same weapons they were using in Iraq and Afghanistan we needed to use at home. And to think about how far we've come, that we're talking about a bipartisan Safer Communities Act passage, and seeing all the shirts, the orange shirts and the red shirts and the blue shirts and the purple shirts, and what you've built, it makes me really proud to see what we've done together. And I know there's more to do. And the law that we're talking about is so critical. Tools in our hands as attorneys general, and you just heard A.G. Ellison, A.G. Tongs here, and so many of our partners, giving us more tools matters. It helps. This is not an unsolvable problem. And so there's a few things that I know. The first is that this is a public safety and a public health crisis. And I am tired of listening to people lecture me about what's good for public safety when they're fighting for guns in our kids' schools and guns in our parks and guns in zoos and guns in the hands of violent domestic violence offenders. And I live at the end of the iron pipeline, as Peter said. New Jersey, I'm so proud that we have the strongest gun laws in America, and Governor Murphy has been a staunch advocate. 3 rounds of new gun safety bills signed over the last 5 years. But 82% of guns used in the commission of crime in New Jersey did not start in New Jersey. Every single time I'm in a group with law enforcement or community leaders, I ask, when was the last time you saw a gun used in the commission of crime that didn't start outside of our state? Nobody remembers. And so having these federal tools and having the full backing of the White House, and I have to thank President Biden for not accepting that we couldn't get something done, and the Department of Justice and the ATF, and having a full-time leader of the ATF and real leadership at local level who matters, this all makes a difference. Because the second thing I know is that while this is a public safety crisis, what we have done is moving the needle. The tools that we're given moves the needle. Last year in New Jersey, my first year in office, shootings went down in our state by 25% across the entire state. Every single one of our cities saw a double-digit decline in shootings. That's not an accident. You're 6 times more likely to be shot in Mississippi, and this is no disrespect to Mississippi, than you are in New Jersey. It's because of the tools we have and the way we use them. And it's because we've taken a multi-pronged approach, starting with our enforcement efforts, using tools like the trafficking law that's in the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, investing, as we talked about earlier, so critical, and this act does this in violence intervention efforts, bringing them into the law enforcement response because they can reach people that law enforcement and cops can't. And as A.G. Ellison talked about, making those who profit off this bloodshed pay. And I'll wrap here. The third thing I know, and this is relevant to enforcement efforts, but it's relevant to everything, is that this, as Ruth said, is an ongoing fight. It is really critical for us to talk about our successes and show that what we are doing is working. That this is not window dressing. This matters. But we also need to know, as I know, that the guns keep coming. And so the work doesn't stop. There's still more laws to pass. There's still more tools to do. We are in court every day fighting for the tools we have and pushing for new ones and and you should hold those in your states accountable when folks like Senator Murphy get together and pass really important laws and give us tools. We, in positions like mine and attorneys general, need to use them. And if we use them, the numbers that I talked about in New Jersey can be real. Those are hundreds of people that are not dead right now. Hundreds of dinner tables that have no empty chairs. So I am so grateful to have these tools. I'm grateful, yes, to live in a state like New Jersey, but we are a United States and we know this is a national problem and we cannot address it alone.
Agreed. Thank you, Matt. Rob, in Uvalde, and in shooting after shooting after shooting, we saw the same thing. Young men who can't buy a beer walk into a gun store and purchase, some of the most deadly armaments that have been produced in the history of humanity, and they've been doing it legally, passing a background check. So a key provision of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which I know is already having an impact, is this enhanced background check for young people. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and some of the successes that we've had?
Yeah, of course, Peter. Thank you for the question. Thank you for everyone who's here. Thank you especially to Senators Murphy and Blumenthal, who've really turned our heartbreak into hope, the hope of a safer tomorrow and safer communities. Because we know that to get to safer communities, we need to have stronger gun laws and substantial investment in community-based solutions. And that's what this bill provided. And each part of this bill went to a different aspect of gun violence. And Peter, I really appreciate that question because we know it's gonna take a ton of solutions and honestly, a ton of elected officials to come together. And I looked on this stage and I thought to myself, we're all from different states, red states, purple states, blue states. But each one of us on this stage has a US Senator who voted for the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Including Republican Senator Roy Blunt. And that is what the progress we need is building on that success. And when we think about this provision in particular, as Peter said, what we know is that the most horrific mass shootings are committed predominantly by people under 21. What we know is that 18, 19, and 20-year-olds commit homicides at 3 times the rates of those older than 21. What we know is we have to invest in community and we have to stop illegal access to guns. And so what this background check provision does is it says we're not just gonna put a name into a computer system and let that do the work. I mean, I know we all think AI is our future, but that's not enough. What we have to be doing is actually talking to real people. And in this background check process, thanks to Congress and President Biden, we're not just putting a name into a system. We're going into the state to actually check to see if there's prohibiting records. We're talking to the custodians of mental health records. And I think most importantly, and the mayor would agree, is they're actually calling local law enforcement to see if there's flags. And the key to this provision is that it does not criminalize young people. It is really just rooted in preventing access. The crime is to sell a gun to someone who would fail this check, not for that young person who has that record. That is incredibly important. And Peter, when it comes to success, right? I mean, I love policy, and a lot of you do as well, but policy is only progress if it actually follows the data and saves lives, right? Our mission isn't just to pass laws, because we don't measure our success in the laws we pass, but in the lives that we save. And what I can tell you is this new enhanced background check is working. It's been in place for about a year. There's been 100,000 18, 19, 20-year-olds who've gone through this check. And denials have been increased by 20% thanks just to this law. And so, Peter, this is the success we need, and we need to build on it. So when local law enforcement gets that call, they're not just saying, hey, I have a record, but they're saying, should I use my red flag law? Should I use another tool? And as the Attorney General said, let's use all the tools we have at our disposal, because if we leave tools in the toolbox, we are just going to be less safe.
Thank you. Absolutely. And Rob, you mentioned, the fact that this was obviously a bipartisan Safer Communities Act, 65 votes in the United States Senate, up there close to the high water mark in terms of in bipartisan support of the most important elements of the Biden agenda. That's a bipartisan vote that reflects the bipartisan consensus that we see across the country, right? 90% of Americans, Democrats, Republicans, gun owners, non-gun owners, who all agree. Strong gun laws save lives. Mayor Lucas, you obviously the mayor of Kansas City, but somebody who spends a significant amount of time as an ambassador for your community across the country, talking to Democrats, but also talking to Republicans. So what in those conversations is the impact of this law? The fact that, finally, after 30 years, the Senate comes together on a bipartisan basis and says, we got to do something. What's the impact on the ground?
The hardest thing often in public life, as you all know, and I know you all are engaged, is getting people to believe that change can happen, is getting people to believe that their advocacy is important. I was at church in Kansas City not long ago, and a woman walked up to me and she said, what are you going to do about all the murders in our city? And by the way, we have far too many. Our red states are less safe. Gun laws make a true and impactful difference, and there is a genocide right now in our cities based upon it. But I told her a whole bunch of stuff, and she said at the end, but you the mayor. If you can't do nothing, then how am I ever going to try to do something? And so what I then told her was, well, you know what? There's something good that actually happened in Washington. There was something good that happened there, which means that something good could happen in our legislature one day, something good can happen at City Hall, and ultimately in our communities. Sometimes I know on this issue, it feels like you are pushing a boulder up a mountain. Trust me, I know it. There is nothing that I do. And by the way, I'm going to brag and then get back to my main point, right? My city's got it going on. We keep winning Super Bowls. Like there's all this good stuff happening. But the thing that makes it tough is when I go home at night and when I hear about another young child who's lost their life, when I hear about shootings, which we have every day in my city of only 500,000 people, when we hear about the tragedies again and again and again, and frankly, when we hear about tragedies and we almost forget the names of each. So what this success meant was that we got to push back on that narrative. We got to tell the governor of my state, the people all around me, I'm just surrounded by states that say we don't need to do anything about it, that no, somebody is actually doing something about it. And the bigger thing is that all of your groups, because all of y'all are present in my part of the country too, even your Connecticut groups, you have like allies where I am, right? My thing that I would say is that frankly, we are making a difference. We are making change, and fundamentally that there will be positive change long term. We talked about domestic violence before. What the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act allowed us to do, right, is pass an ordinance that made it, because for whatever reason the state wouldn't enforce these things, we created a municipal ordinance violation because they preempted us on all gun laws except federal laws. So now it's a municipal ordinance violation if you are a domestic abuser who has a gun. Why do we have to bring that? The U.S. Attorney's Office is too busy. Our local law enforcement can go to a city prosecutor, get the guns out of the hands of the person terrorizing their families and their homes. That's what this law means. And so I say just very simply, keep believing in the impact that you're having, because you are making a difference everywhere, even in the rubiest red of places. We need you and your advocacy is saving lives on the streets of my city and so many others.
Thank you, Mayor Lucas. Absolutely. Now let's move to conclude this panel by looking ahead. And Rob, I'm going to start with you. If you could break down in just like a minute and a half, and I'm a policy nerd just like you are, right? There was a provision in the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act that made an amendment to what's called the Engaged in the Business statute. That was followed up by a very significant background checks executive action by President Biden. Tell us what we should be pushing for in the months ahead.
Look, Peter, I think a minute and a half means I went too long the last time, which I appreciate. Look, the truth is the best is yet to come with the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Bipartisan Safer Communities Act gave the tools to Department of Justice and ATF to really get after no background check gun sales. The president gave them the direction to do that, and now it's up to the Department of Justice and ATF to make good on that promise. Because what the law said is that if you're out there selling guns to strangers, dozens of guns online or at gun shows, to domestic abusers, to gun traffickers, to individuals who are engaged in the iron pipeline, well, this law now is looking at you. And it's going to crack down on those who are making these commercial sales. That's what we want to see from the ATF, is going at the source of these illegal guns. And so we're hoping to see new regulation, new enforcement, so that we actually turn that poll number, 90% of gun people support background checks, into actual policy. And the reason we've done that is because it's not just polls on paper anymore, but it's people at the polls. And that's all of you.
Well said. Attorney General Platkin, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, in addition to some strong new statutes, contain hundreds of millions of dollars in funding that is flowing at this very moment into communities across the country, including communities in New Jersey. How are you putting that funding to work?
We love federal money. So to all the senators, I have to thank Senator Booker and Senator Menendez as well. Thank you for all of the money in this bill. Again, this is real stuff. We've requested millions of dollars to implement our ERPO law, our red flag law. That is taking guns out of the hands of hundreds of individuals suffering from mental health issues in the state. People who, through our intelligence-based enforcement efforts, we've identified either through law enforcement or their own families came forward to a court and said, these are people who should not have a firearm. That money will save lives. There is no question that that money will save lives. And importantly, as we implement those, put those dollars to work, as the law requires and as we would always do, we are bringing the community in to be a part of how we spend that. And I think that's really important. This movement is built in so many ways on the information provided by the community, the experience and the lived experiences of people who've suffered the traumatic impact of gun violence. And when we listen to them, and when we develop programs based on the dollars that were given by Congress at the state and local level with their voices as a part of it, we are better and stronger and more effective at deploying those resources. So that's one example that I know. And we know, last thing I'll say, people talk about mental health. New Jersey has a mental health crisis. Every state in this country has a mental crisis. This country is one of every single country in the world that has a mental health crisis. But it's the guns that make the difference. And if we can take the guns out of people's hands who should not have them and are suffering, and yes, get them the help they need, but take the guns out of their hands, as we will do thanks to this law, we will save more lives.
Absolutely. Now, Ruth, I'm going to give you the last question here in the vein of what comes next. We, as part of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, we narrowed the boyfriend loophole. I know you have been fighting on this issue for years and years and years. So in the domestic violence community, how can we work with you in terms of what's next to protect families and intimate partners from domestic violence?
So there's a couple of things that I want to make sure that we understand. We've been successful with the safer communities, right? But don't forget, they're going to come another way to make sure that we are not successful in the interest of the Second Amendment. So I just need to say that because we're already seeing it happen in regards to protection orders and domestic violence with the ruling out of the 5th District, Rahimi. It's horrible. And what it says is that, and I apologize because this is not related directly to the better communities, but I do want to say that let's be aware that they'll come another way, and we have to constantly be on our guard. For many, many, many years. He made me sound so old, which I am. So Rahimi out of the 5th District says that he can this person, Rahimi, can have a firearm under protection order, and he should not have had his firearm removed. So I give you that as an example of how we have to stay on guard. Very much like what we've talked about is, don't forget that your voice matters. And while we're dealing with the successes, there's also going to be these other efforts that we have to keep an eye on. As a domestic violence advocate, activist, survivor, and a gun violence survivor, I appreciate you, but please don't stop. And do not forget about domestic violence as you're doing this. It impacts our communities. It is more than about lethality. It's really about that same thing that we were talking about, mental health. If we don't remove guns from domestic abusers, we're going to lose lives, and we do lose lives. So please don't forget that. But mostly, thank you all so much for everything you do every day, because it does make a difference. That's why we're here today.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ruth. Thank you to this powerhouse panel. You heard it here. Don't stop. Move ahead. Keep on going. Let's implement the hell out of this law.
That's right.
And thank you so much to Senator Murphy and everybody else who brought us together here. And let's get ready to see President Biden a little bit later.